The Vatican has one of the most feared reputations in history, not because people know exactly what is inside its archive, but because they do not. Behind the walls of the smallest sovereign state on earth sits a paper empire of letters, trial records, diplomatic reports, manuscripts, and files that touch kings, wars, science, heresy, empire, and faith. The movies call it the secret archive. The Vatican calls it the apostolic archive. The internet calls it proof that something is being hidden. And that tension is exactly why the myth refuses to die. If you only know the conspiracy version, the story sounds simple. There are forbidden rooms. There are banned gospels. There are sealed files. There are whispers about machines that could look through time, prophecies that were never released, and relics too dangerous to show the public. But the real story is stronger than the fantasy, because the truth is not that the archive is one locked room with one explosive secret. The truth is that it is a vast system built over centuries by an institution that understood one thing better than almost anyone else: whoever controls the record controls the memory of history. To understand why the Vatican's forbidden secrets still terrify historians, you have to separate three layers that the internet constantly mixes together. First, there is the documented archive, real shelves, real manuscripts, real state papers, real trial records. Second, there is restricted history, material that is hard to access because of privacy, diplomacy, conservation, or simple bureaucracy. Third, there is myth, the legends that grow in the shadow of any institution old enough, rich enough, and powerful enough to outlive empires. This documentary is going through all three. Let us start with the name, because even the name helped create the legend. For decades people heard the phrase Vatican Secret Archive and imagined one thing: a place designed to keep humanity away from forbidden truths. But the Vatican itself argued that this was a misunderstanding. In 2019, Pope Francis formally changed the name from the Vatican Secret Archive to the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The point was not to create a new institution. The point was to correct how the old name sounded in modern language. In the older Latin sense, secretum did not mean hidden in the thriller movie sense. It meant private, personal, reserved to the Pope. The archive was private because it belonged directly to the Roman pontiff, not because it was literally a chamber of supernatural secrets. That detail matters, but it did not kill the myth. In some ways it strengthened it. Because if the Vatican had to rename the archive to stop people from imagining hidden truths, that means the problem was already centuries old. The word secret had done its work. By the time the Vatican tried to clean up the language, the archive had already become one of the most mythologized institutions on earth. What makes that myth so durable is that the archive is not imaginary. It is real, massive, and old enough to hold material from periods most states only know through fragments. According to reporting from the Associated Press in 2024, the Vatican Apostolic Archive contains roughly 85 kilometers of shelving, much of it underground in a two-story reinforced bunker. The archive preserves papal documentation, records from Vatican offices, diplomatic material from papal representatives around the world, and collections connected to aristocratic families and religious orders. That is not a symbolic archive. That is a civilization-sized memory bank. And the opening of that memory bank has always been selective. The Vatican's own 2019 explanation of the archive's name change says the archive was officially open to researchers from every country only in 1881, though earlier scholars sometimes worked from authenticated copies supplied by the archive's officials. So even in the most charitable reading, access was never universal, never casual, and never immediate. It required permission, purpose, and patience. That alone is enough to generate legends, because every restricted archive creates the same psychological effect. The fewer people who can enter, the larger the imagination becomes outside the door. But there is another side to this story that matters just as much. The Vatican has also spent years trying to make portions of its holdings more accessible, not less. The Vatican Library's digital platform shows just how large that effort is. The library says its digitization project aims to preserve and publish 80,000 codices, and the online collection already provides access to thousands of manuscripts. A 2024 quarterly update on the Digital Vatican Library reported 707 newly digitized manuscripts and more than 243,000 added images in a single period. Another Vatican statement in 2024 said over 27,500 manuscripts were already available online in full. That is not the behavior of an institution trying to hide every scrap of paper it owns. And yet, the same transparency intensifies the obsession. Because the public can now see enough to know the Vatican preserves extraordinary material, while still not seeing everything. The result is the perfect conspiracy atmosphere, visible magnitude, partial access, and a backlog so vast that missing knowledge can always be interpreted as intentional concealment. Now consider the real documents that keep the archive's reputation alive. One of the most striking examples described by the Associated Press is the original 1530 letter signed and sealed by the overwhelming majority of the English House of Lords, pressuring Pope Clement VII to grant Henry VIII a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. That is not rumor. That is a document with direct consequences for the history of England, the English Reformation, and the permanent fracture between Rome and the English crown. It is exactly the kind of material that makes the archive feel dangerous, because it preserves the moment when theology, monarchy, and political survival collided. Another real note of fear is the Galileo affair. The archive contains material linked to one of the most famous conflicts in Western intellectual history, the struggle between institutional authority and scientific evidence. Even when people do not know the exact documents, the symbol is enough. They hear Galileo and imagine a library of suppressed truth, a place where ideas were judged not only by whether they were correct, but by whether they were permitted. Whether that picture is simplified or not, it sticks because it points to a real wound in cultural memory. Then there is Napoleon. The AP reporting on the archive noted the story of Napoleon's sacking of the archive in 1810. That episode alone could sustain an entire documentary. When an empire decides your archive matters enough to seize, transport, or scatter, it confirms that paper is power. Archives are not passive museums. They are strategic assets. They contain legitimacy, precedent, claims, diplomatic memory, and reputational danger. Once people understand that, the fantasy of hidden Vatican secrets no longer feels childish. It feels structurally plausible. The same is true for the documents of Pope Pius XII. For decades, historians argued over whether the wartime pope did enough, said enough, or concealed too much during the Holocaust. In 2020, Pope Francis opened the files from Pius XII's pontificate ahead of schedule so scholars could study them. That single decision tells you everything about why the archive generates dread. It means the Vatican was holding material that could influence one of the most morally sensitive historical debates in the modern world. Even if the reason for delay was archival procedure and not malicious intent, the effect on the public imagination was the same: history appeared to be waiting behind a locked door. This is the point where archive becomes myth, and myth becomes a full ecology. Because once people know the Vatican has preserved real material tied to Henry VIII, Galileo, Napoleon, and World War II, the next leap is easy. If those files are real, then what else might be real? What other letters were never published? What other reports never entered textbooks? What other private assessments of heresy, science, diplomacy, scandal, or political collapse remain unseen by the casual public? The scale of the archive makes those questions impossible to close. Then we come to the second engine of Vatican fear: forbidden books. The Vatican Archive and the Vatican Library are not the same institution, but in the public imagination they blur into one giant apparatus of control over memory. That is where the history of the index of forbidden books becomes so powerful. Britannica describes the Index Librorum Prohibitorum as the list of books once forbidden by Roman Catholic authority as dangerous to faith or morals. The first printed Roman index appeared in 1559, and the system continued in various forms until 1966. Over time it included or condemned the works of major thinkers and writers, among them Voltaire, Edward Gibbon, Francis Bacon, Daniel Defoe, Giordano Bruno, and works connected to Copernican astronomy. Even people who know little about Catholic history instinctively understand what the index symbolizes. It symbolizes a hierarchy deciding which ideas were safe, which ideas were dangerous, and which readers could be trusted. Once that mental image exists, the leap to the phrase forbidden Vatican secrets is almost automatic. A culture that maintained a formal list of prohibited books for centuries looks, from the outside, like a culture perfectly capable of maintaining prohibited rooms, prohibited files, and prohibited interpretations of the past. To be precise, the existence of the index does not prove that the Vatican is hiding one single explosive revelation from humanity. That would be sloppy reasoning. But it does prove something important and more subtle. The Church developed institutions for regulating knowledge, restricting circulation, and managing the boundaries of acceptable thought. And that historical memory changes how every archive shelf is perceived. The Vatican is not viewed as a neutral warehouse. It is viewed as an institution that historically understood the political consequences of information. That is why the online legends keep multiplying. Some of them are just recycled pulp fiction. People claim the Vatican has hidden gospels that would overturn Christianity, proof that Jesus had a completely different historical identity, files on extraterrestrial contact, maps of lost civilizations, or the so-called chronovisor, the legendary machine that allegedly allowed its operators to view events from the past. There are stories about sealed rooms, occult devices, and relics too controversial to exhibit. There is no public evidence that such spectacular claims are sitting in a neat box waiting to be revealed. But the reason these rumors persist is not simply because people are gullible. It is because the Vatican already possesses the one thing a conspiracy requires in order to survive: a real and undeniable infrastructure of restricted memory. And the more you study the Vatican as an institution, the more understandable that becomes. The Vatican is not merely a church headquarters. It is the historical nerve center of a transnational institution that shaped diplomacy, education, censorship, art, science, empire, and moral law across centuries. A state archive from a short-lived kingdom may hold local secrets. The Vatican archive potentially intersects with the decision-making of Europe, colonial encounters, missionary movements, doctrinal battles, royal marriages, suppressed orders, and internal church crises across continents. In plain language, if you were trying to imagine the one archive most likely to attract global obsession, it would be hard to design a better candidate. There is also a physical reason the archive feels ominous. Most people never see archives. They see museums, cathedrals, monuments, and exhibitions. Archives are different. Archives are built for custody, not spectacle. Long corridors, catalogs, boxes, controlled access, reading rooms, staff mediation, conservation rules, and waiting periods create a ritual of distance. In cinema, that architecture reads as secrecy. In institutional reality, it often reads as preservation. But visually and emotionally, the difference can disappear. A box protected for conservation can look identical to a box protected because its contents are dangerous. Now add the Vatican Library to this atmosphere. The digital Vatican Library makes parts of the institution more visible than ever, but visibility does not destroy mystery when the collection is that enormous. The library openly states that the project aims to digitize 80,000 codices. That number alone is enough to bend the imagination. 80,000 codices means languages, centuries, religious traditions, commentaries, scientific texts, maps, annotated Bibles, liturgical books, political memoranda, and manuscripts whose significance may be obvious only to a handful of specialists. Even if a quarter of such a collection is digitized, the human mind naturally fixates on the remainder. And this is where the darkest and most realistic interpretation begins. The most unsettling Vatican secret may not be a single lost gospel or a hidden machine. It may be the simple fact that no ordinary viewer can hold the whole picture in their head. The archive is too large. The library is too large. The catalogs are too complex. The languages are too specialized. The institutional history is too layered. In that environment, secrecy does not need to function like a locked movie vault. It can function through scale, bureaucracy, and expertise. Something can remain effectively invisible even if it is not being theatrically hidden. Historians understand this problem better than anyone. Access does not instantly produce knowledge. A file can be open and still unread. A document can be cataloged and still ignored. A manuscript can be digitized and still be inaccessible to most of the world because few people can read the script, the language, or the context. That is why the archive remains so psychologically potent. It is not just a place where information may be restricted. It is also a place where information may be available in theory but unreachable in practice. That practical distance is what keeps the legends alive. When people ask whether the Vatican is hiding something, the answer is not a clean yes or no. The documented answer is that the Vatican does preserve extraordinary materials, has restricted access procedures, has a long institutional history of managing knowledge, and has spent recent years both opening and digitizing important holdings. The darker answer, the one that unsettles people, is that no archive of this scale can ever be fully transparent in ordinary human terms. There will always be unopened boxes, uncatalogued corners, delayed collections, fragile items, diplomatic sensitivities, private papers, and scholars waiting for permission. And because this is the Vatican, every normal archival delay is interpreted against 2,000 years of theology, power, scandal, and symbolism. A backlog becomes a cover-up. A reading rule becomes suppression. A cataloging gap becomes a forbidden chamber. Sometimes those interpretations are unfair. Sometimes they are sensational. But they do not emerge from nowhere. They emerge from the collision between a real archive of immense importance and an institution whose moral authority has repeatedly been tested by history. So what should terrify historians about the Vatican's forbidden secrets? Not the weakest internet claims. Not the idea that one single file will fall out and rewrite all of civilization overnight. What should terrify them is something colder and more realistic. The archive proves that history is not just what happened. History is what was written down, what was preserved, what was copied, what survived looting, what was catalogued, what was opened, what was delayed, and what generations were permitted to study. In that sense, the Vatican archive is not frightening because it may contain one monstrous revelation. It is frightening because it shows how power and memory have always moved together. That is why the Vatican's forbidden secrets still feel alive. The archive contains enough real material to justify obsession, enough restricted process to sustain suspicion, and enough myth to keep the public looking for one more hidden shelf. Some of the fear comes from conspiracy culture. Some of it comes from anti-Catholic fantasy. But some of it comes from a sober historical truth. If you want to understand how institutions shape civilization, you do not just study armies, crowns, or markets. You study archives. And among the archives of the world, few are more symbolically charged than the one under the Vatican. A place once called secret. A place officially opened but never casual. A place storing the paper trail of kings, scientists, wars, doctrinal battles, and centuries of internal judgment. A place where myth can attach itself to every silence. That is why the obsession does not end. The real terror is not that the Vatican holds one forbidden object. The real terror is that it has spent centuries deciding what should be remembered, what should be preserved, and when the world would be allowed to see it. Subscribe to Shadow Archive for more dark history documentaries.